my neighbors, the people in my community, they experience the same thing. We all experience the same thing. I was a child, but even the adults experience the same thing. They taught their children how to behave. You don't go to this particular store. We don't shop in there. They don't want us. You do get on a certain bus to go south as opposed to going to New York. These are restrictions placed upon us. And then I was blessed to go south to spend the summer with relatives. And I knew where I could go and where I could not go. And they especially had to talk to me because to my cousins, I was the cousin from up the road, up north. And they know that the restrictions up north were not as severe as the restrictions in the south. And of course I was mouthy, so they had to tell me, keep your mouth shut, mind what you say.
How did you feel about that?
I listened and I obeyed because I heard of the horror stories. Of course, the horror story of that child from Emmett Till from Chicago, who went south and was brutally murdered. We all saw that picture in the Jet. And it was disturbing. It was a picture that caused nightmares. And his mother insisted that the undertaker not try to close the casket or fix him up. Her statement, I remember, was, let everybody see what they've done to my child. And when people saw it, they realized just how wicked it was. I said to you earlier that when I was demonstrating, I had the white folk around me spitting and the dogs barking. I experienced that. But the story cannot end there for me. I must tell you how at that eatery, I called from work to speak to my mama one day, and I couldn't get her. And that evening when I got to my apartment and I called and I reached her, I wanted to know where she had been that day. She was retired. Her best girlfriend lived 2 doors away. They went to the same church. They were in the same lodge. They couldn't get enough of seeing each other and associating with each other. That's just the way it was. We called her girlfriend Aunt. Her girlfriend's children called Mama Aunt. That's the way it was. And Mama simply said, well, Polly and I did not feel like fixing lunch today, so we went to such and such a restaurant to get our food. And I said, you did? You went in there, you sat down, you ate? You see, segregation had ended. And I smiled because it made all those cold Saturday mornings worthwhile. Getting up and demonstrating, going to different restaurants, going in, being put out, walking with the signs. It made it that much more worthwhile. And Mama's gone now, but that made me so very, very happy that I had worked to earn her right to be treated as a first-class citizen rather than a second-class citizen. You didn't hear very much on television or in the Washington Post or the Baltimore Sun, but the Afro. They would put the main stories in a red headline across the top of the paper. And when you got the Afro, when the little boys sold the Afro in the neighborhood, and they read all about it, this happens, that happens. And when you got the Afro, or the Jet, and you read what happened in our community, and you saw the pictures, and it was like, wow, how proud we were of her. What a great change this is.
What did you hear about?
Of course, we heard that she refused to give up her seat, and that this was the catalyst for the start of the civil rights movement. There had been efforts before, but this was the major thing because they had talked about doing it in that city, getting someone to do this, but they had not yet made up their mind to do it. And they wanted somebody who would be representative of the community. And Mrs. Rosa Parks was perfect, except that she wasn't selected to do this at this time. She just did it on her own, without anybody realizing that it would happen. Fate pushed things forward, while our good ministers were talking about strategy. And in this I see God. She went on and said, I'm tired, I'm not getting up. She was arrested, they had to run down and see about her, and then the struggle began. And they taught the world that the color of money is green, because they showed that transit company, we pay for your existence. The ridership of the African American community is greatest because the Caucasians have the cars, because they can get better credit. And I remember one story I read, and I loved it, of one large black lady who scolded a black man about standing at the bus stop. And he declared that he was not going to participate and he was going to get the bus and ride. And how she went in her bag and pulled out a head of cabbage, lifted it up, came down on his head and said, "Let the power fall." Whereupon it was an act of violence, and we were nonviolent in the demonstration movement. But she allowed that head of cabbage to come down with all her might on his head. And then he realized he had better listen and pay attention, because there were consequences from his own community, right, as opposed to the consequences from the Caucasian community of lynching and hanging and tarring and feathering. They were tired of it, and Mrs. Rosa Parks sounded the alarm loud and clear. We're tired of it. We're not going to take it anymore.
That cabbage story is a great story. Yes.
Yes. And her statement was, "Let the power fall."
But did you know her personally?
No, I read it.
Oh, you read it?
I read it, yes. Let the power fall.
That's cool.
Yes. We had begun to demonstrate because of the ministers who had been arrested. But I don't think we were as activists here as they were in the South. Their treatment in the South was much more harsh, of course, than here. And remember, I told you, some things had begun to change in D.C. before they changed in Baltimore or Richmond.
Mm-hmm. What things have begun to change?
Some of the stores had begun to open, like the drugstore lunch counters were permitting you to go there and eat.
Oh, before the Rosa Parks?
In that period,
okay.
in that period.
Okay.
Yeah, in that period. But it didn't happen until after in places like Baltimore. Or let me tell you, one thing that changed here in D.C., they had begun to let you go and get housing where you could afford to. Whereas in Baltimore, they had closed housing. You couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. They had covenants. Folk who bought their house promised that when they sold their house, it would not be sold to a Negro or a colored person.
That was
In D.C., in the covenant, in D.C. and in Baltimore. And in some cases, the covenant included Jews. We won't sell to Jews. But the dastardly thing is that Jews had covenants that they wouldn't sell to Negroes and colored. And Marion Barry said something once, and I wholeheartedly agreed with it. Anyone who has ever been mistreated and discriminated against should never mistreat or discriminate against another person. He said that many years ago, and I agreed with it. Because some of our Jewish brothers and sisters were discriminated against. They were hated with as much fervor in the South as we were. Yet they would turn around and discriminate against us. So see, we were discriminated against from all sides. It reminds me of my favorite poem by Langston Hughes, "Life ain't been no crystal stair. It's been splitters and tacks and those steps." But he ends it by saying, "I still climbing, I still climbing." And that's what we're doing today. Today, we are achieving more than we have ever achieved, especially with education. We need to achieve more, because in some instances there have been a digression, if you please. Our children are not completing school. During one period, it was important to get your high school diploma. That's what many children were taught. Get your high school diploma. Many children went on to schools of higher learning or went on to become beauticians or mechanics or what have you. But now we have fallen back some. We have a large number of our children who are not completing school, a large number. And the class struggle is increasing because there are children who are finishing high school and finishing college, disparity. And then in the other sense, there are children who are dropping out. You see the difference? This group is accelerating and achieving, and this group has slowed down, and they're not doing anything, and they're into drugs and alcoholism and other bad things. And that's a shame. We've got to make a change in that. And so many people will say, we got to do something about these children being murdered in this very building. Many of us went to a funeral just last week because the head of maintenance lost his daughter. She was shot in the head and murdered, 20 years old, from a struggling family, a family that's working. But they say she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't like that statement, because wherever you are, it's the right place if you choose to be there. You have a right to be where you want to be. It may be the wrong time, but it's not the wrong place. And so, unfortunately, our children are being murdered, especially the innocent children with the drive-by shootings. And we've got to do something about that. What makes one young person just decide, I want to shoot a gun haphazardly and murder someone? And then at the end of the trial to stand and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry doesn't cut it. Because if you were sorry, you should have been sorry before you got the gun and fired the gun. We came through a period in this community during the 50s when your neighbor could tell your parent about your lack of respect or your misbehavior, and you were reprimanded. And I'm being polite. You got a whipping. The last thing you wanted your neighbor to report on was your misbehavior. But now, we're in a situation where your neighbor cannot speak to you because the mom or the daddy might shoot at you. The teacher is afraid to tell your parent about your misbehavior because the parent might cuss the teacher out. The very one who's trying to put knowledge in the head of your child has to be concerned about you. It's sad. We've got to turn that around. I don't know how we will do it, but we've got to find some kind of way to change that. There's a continuity. Barack Obama wouldn't be sitting where he is now were it not for Rosa Parks. And even though he's being challenged by so many people because they never thought he had a chance of winning, and they want to turn it around, of course, and they, you know who I mean, and get him out.
Who is they?
They being the Tea Partiers who are hiding behind the former banner known as Ku Klux Klan. Yes, I said it, I believe it.
I have to throw a monkey wrench in.
Can I agree? I'm glad.
I have to throw a monkey wrench in because I was working a job, whatever, and actually I was peddling a magazine, Christian Science Monitor.
Yes.
So I'm reading it on the phone, and I'm surprised to find that their candidate is actually African American. He's the CEO. So how do you feel about that? I mean,
By color.
yeah. How do you?
We have window dressing going on. We still have flies in the buttermilk. If you're familiar with the Southern expression, flies in the buttermilk is that sometimes they always want a window dresser. A window dresser to say, oh, we have somebody here who is African American, and that's the person who will be touted out so you can see them. Flies in the buttermilk means that you get one, but you see that fly in the buttermilk because the buttermilk is what? White, pure white. And you see the fly floating around in the buttermilk. So yes, that happens. The Republicans are always going to have a person or a few people, but are they trying to recruit us as they should be? No. During the time of the 50s, many African Americans were Republicans.
Most, right?
But they did not fight for integration. They did not approve of integration.